Are you curious about the pre and post condition blocks in Terraform? Well, this is the video for you. Let's dig in. What's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, nedinthecloud.com. I'm changing it a little bit because I'm not on Twitter as much lately. So if you just go to my website, nedinthecloud.com, you can find all the different ways to contact me. Honestly, I'm a little more active on LinkedIn these days for what I think are fairly obvious reasons. Anyhow, today's topic is the pre and post condition blocks that exist in Terraform, and we're going to see how you can create them, what they're used for, and some caveats about their use. Before we dig into that, I just want to let everyone know that my Terraform Associate Certification Guide has been updated for the latest version of the exam, 003. So if you're planning on taking the Terraform Associate exam, 003 is now 100% live. I think it's the only version you can take. And if you're looking for a study guide that's been updated, hey, I have one. And the link is down in the description. With that out of the way, let's dig into pre and post conditions. When it comes to developing good code, you need to sanitize your input, check your assumptions, and make some guarantees that can be relied on by the next link in the chain. And that's true for all code, including Terraform. Now, with this video, I thought I would explore how the use of pre and post conditions can make your Terraform code more reliable and easier to maintain. It starts with validation. Now, the name of the game when it comes to verifying assertions and making guarantees is validation, and it all starts with the humble input variable, where you can use both the type and the validation arguments to ensure that the input is of the correct type and it has the proper value or the allowed values that you define with the validation argument. Now, I actually covered the validation argument in a previous video, so I won't go too deep into it now. The link is in the description and the who's a what's a thinger that appears somewhere over my noggin. The upside is that you can catch validation issues really early on, way before Terraform has to load state data into memory or draw its resource graph. When you're trying to iterate quickly, that's a huge benefit. The downside of the validation block is that it's limited to only the variable value itself and anything that you hard code into the condition argument. You could check to see if a virtual machine size is in a list of values, but that list of values needs to be hard coded into the config. You could make sure that a CIDR address is valid, but you can't go and grab a list of CIDR address ranges from a data source and make sure it's not being used. The reason is because of when Terraform does variable validation in its workflow. The validation happens before the resource graph is drawn, before data sources are refreshed, so you can't reference anything that's in state data or data sources within the validation block. You can't even reference other variables, input variables that exist in your configuration. So the answer to this conundrum is to use pre and post conditions in your resources and data sources. Pre and post conditions were introduced in Terraform 1.2. So if you're not up to 1.2 yet, you can't use them, but maybe upgrade might be a good idea. They're a new argument and they go in the lifecycle meta argument block, and they can be used with resources, with data sources, and with outputs. You can specify the precondition or postcondition block multiple times for a particular object in the same way that you could use the validation block multiple times for an input variable. Just like the validation block for input variables, the pre and post condition blocks take a condition argument that resolves to either true or false, and then an error message to display if the condition is not met, if it evaluates to false. If Terraform encounters an error, it will stop the processing of the plan or the apply. The point at which it stops processing depends on whether you're using a pre or a post condition. So let's look at preconditions first. Preconditions are run before the object it's associated with is evaluated. You can use a precondition on a resource, a data source, or an output. Since the precondition is running before the object is evaluated, that means two important things. Number one, you cannot reference the object itself or its attributes inside of the precondition. Number two is that Terraform will fail on a precondition before it fails on an invalid object argument or value. So the first point means that you can't use the self expression to refer to attributes of the object that you're running the precondition check on. The second point means that if you have an invalid value for an object argument, but the precondition fails, Terraform will only error on that precondition. It doesn't actually evaluate the arguments that you've submitted for that resource. So it won't tell you that you have an invalid value until you fix the precondition and it gets to evaluate those arguments. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to be aware of. Preconditions can be thought of as assumptions you're making about the state of the world before that object is evaluated. If the assumption is wrong, then the object can't be evaluated correctly. So you want to stop things in its tracks. Preconditions also fail faster than creating the object or instantiating the object, I should say, since it doesn't need to talk to the provider API or wait for a failure. Now, that can be a good thing if you're trying to speed up your development process. I know I waste a lot of time waiting for a resource creation to fail because of a bad input value. It would be nice to know that the input values are bad or some other assumption is bad before I even try to create that resource. Terraform will do its best to run preconditions during the execution plan generation. But if you're referring to attributes of other objects in the precondition and they're not known until the apply phase, then the precondition will be run during the apply phase instead of the execution plan. For instance, let's give an example. Let's say you're referring to the value of the public IP address for the public IP address resource in a precondition for an Azure VM that's going to use that public IP. Now, the value of that public IP address isn't known until the resource is actually created, and that happens during the apply phase, so it can't evaluate that precondition until that resource exists. So it will wait until the apply phase to run the precondition for the Azure virtual machine. Why don't we dig into some precondition examples, and then we'll cover postconditions. Over in my code editor, I have the Terraform Tuesday repository open. If you're looking for that repository, the link is down in the description. And we're working with the folder 2023-0508 pre and post conditions. Now, don't worry about the date. I thought I was going to get this out a little bit earlier, but hey, life happened. So anyway, let's expand out this directory. And in there, I've got two subdirectories. The first one is app-config. That's going to be used to set up some infrastructure that we'll reference later. So I will get to that folder when we get to that. But what we really want to look at is condition checks. And in here is a Terraform configuration. Let's start by looking in the main.tf file. Now for this example, let's say that I'm writing a module to create a virtual network. And I want to allow the user of the module to bring their own resource group. But I want to make sure that the region of that resource group matches the region where I'm trying to deploy my virtual network. I don't want them to shoot themselves in the foot. So in order to get information about that resource group, I'm going to add a resource group data source that will query that resource group and get information about it. And the only input it needs is the name of the resource group, which we're supplying through an input variable. Now, don't worry about the postcondition blocks. We will get to those later. But now let's scroll down to my virtual network that I'm trying to create. For the virtual network, I'm submitting a name and then a region that's defined inside of an input variable. And for the resource group name, I'm referencing that data source. That's the resource group I want to use. I have a postcondition in here, and let me hide this a little bit so it's easier to see. In here, I have a precondition block inside of my lifecycle block. And in there, I've got a condition and an error message. The condition is pretty simple. It's looking at the value that's stored in the input variable region and comparing it to the value that's stored in the attribute location of the resource group I'm retrieving with my data source. If the two are the same, this will evaluate to true, and Terraform will go on its merry way to the next precondition or whatever else it needs to evaluate. If it evaluates to false, then the error message will be printed and Terraform will halt in its planning process. And the error message simply tells me that the resource group that was supplied is not in the region that was supplied. So you need to fix something. Either it's the resource group or the region that you're using. So let me expand this back out for a second and just note that right now the region is set to a default of East US. Now, in order for this to work properly, we do need to first create resource groups to test with. And I have some commands in here in the command.sh. The first one will create a resource group called SoapBase East, and I think you can guess that's in East US, and it has a tag associated that we'll leverage later. And the second group is SoapBase West, which goes in West US, and that has an environment of production. I also have my input variables defined in here inside of the terraform.tf-vars file. So I'm going to temporarily change this to SoapBase West, so it's using the West resource group, but I'm still using the East US as the region for my virtual network. Let me go ahead and pull up the terminal window here and go into the correct directory. There we go, and go into condition checks. I've already run Terraform in it, so now we can run a Terraform plan. And before I do that, I'll expand the view here a little bit so we can actually see what's going on. Of course, there's no button to do that, so I will do this instead. Okay. There we go. So I've expanded the view a little bit so we can see the output in more detail. Now, this might take a moment because as part of the Terraform plan process, it's going to go out and refresh the values that are stored in our data sources. So it's going to go out and get the information that's stored in our resource group and any other data sources that are defined. Once it refreshes those values, it will run through the resources that are in there and do its precondition checks. And our precondition check should fail because we're using the wrong region. And there we go. Our precondition has failed, and it lets us know which condition failed and a little bit of information around the value stored that we were using for our condition. And finally, the actual error message itself, which says that the resource group SoapBase West is not in the region East US. Okay, we knew that was going to happen, but it's good to see that it works properly. Let's set this back to East so that we're using the appropriate region. Okay, so that is an example of doing a precondition check. Now, since we can use data sources for our precondition checks, that means we have access to all the different data sources out there, including the HTTP data source, which could be used to send a request to any URL that you want. So you might use that to check and make sure a service is ready before trying to provision a resource, or maybe grab some information from a service and check the values in there before you provision a resource. Another possibility that I want to throw out there is accessing stored configuration information in something like AWS SSM or Azure App Config. For instance, let's say I have a list of allowed CIDR ranges stored in Azure App Config under the key CIDR lists. And that takes us back to that other folder, app config. So this app config folder has the code in it in a Terraform configuration to deploy Azure App Config and preload it with some values. The values that it throws in there, if we scroll down to the resource itself, it adds a key called CIDR lists and a label called East US, and then some values. So you could interpret this as the allowed values, the allowed CIDR ranges we want to use for the East US region. And so that's something I can also check in my precondition. So let me hide the terminal again so we don't have to worry about that, and go back to the main TF for my condition checks. And there was that second precondition in our virtual network. This precondition is referencing a data source of Azure App Configuration, and it's looking at the CIDR list value. So it's recalling that information from Azure App Config. And the split function is going to take that list of values and split it into a list that Terraform can interpret with the contains function. And we can test to see if that list contains the virtual network address space we want to use. If it does contain it, then that's an allowed range, and we'll say, yeah, go ahead, no error thrown. But if it doesn't contain that list, we can throw an error in our precondition check saying that this address space is not in the allowed list of address spaces. So right now we are submitting an address space of 10.0.0.0/16, and that was one of the allowed values. Let's change that to 10.42. and run our Terraform plan again. Remember, we did update the resource group, so it is in the correct region now, but now it should fail on the other data source or the other precondition that checks to make sure our CIDR address is in the proper range. So once again, it's going to refresh the data sources, run through its preconditions for the resources based off of the graph, and then if any of them fails, which we know it will, it'll return that error message. That might take a moment, so I'm going to jump ahead to when it has completed. Our planning failed. It encountered an error, and we knew that was going to happen, but it also provides us some helpful information. It lists out the values that were in that CIDR list. It tells us the value we submitted with the address space, and then it has the error message at the bottom saying, hey, that address space is not in the list of allowed address spaces. So we can now update it accordingly. I'll go ahead and hide the terminal again, and we'll set this back to 10.0.0.0/16. If we ran a plan now, all of our precondition checks would pass, and we would get an execution plan that we could now run against the target environment. So that covers preconditions, but now let's dig into postconditions. We've already verified that the virtual network we're creating is in the same region as the resource group and is using a valid CIDR address space. But what if we also want to make sure we're deploying to the correct environment based off of tagging? Well, we can use a post condition to make sure the environment tag of the resource group is set to the correct value. Let's go back to our configuration. When I created the resource groups using the commands that are in command.sh, I set an environment tag for each one, and I set the value of that environment tag to production. What we're going to check is to make sure that the environment tag we're setting for the resource, the virtual network in our configuration, matches the environment tag that's already exists for the pre-existing resource group. So let's go back into the configuration, and within the configuration, I have an input variable called environment tag. That's the environment tag we're going to set for the new resource we're creating. So if I scroll all the way down to the virtual network, the tags here, environment is set to var.environment tag. What we want to check before we create this resource, in fact, before we create any resources, let's say we had multiple resources in our config, we first want to check that that submitted value, var.environment tag, matches the resource group that we're referencing with our data source. So we can put a post condition block in our data source and verify that that tag is set appropriately. So if we go back up to our resource group data source, we've got two post condition blocks in here. And there's a reason why there's two. The first one has kind of two checks in it under the condition. The first check makes sure that the length of self.tags is greater than 0. So I want to pick that apart for a second. Because it's a post condition, it's evaluated after this data source is refreshed, which means you now have access to the attributes of the data source object itself. And you reference that using the self expression. So we're getting the tags for that resource group with the expression self.tags. And then we're using the length function to see how long is that map. And in this case, if it's greater than 0, that means we actually have tags set on that resource group. So this would evaluate to true. If no tags are set, then this would evaluate to false, and we'd stop right there. Then we have an AND operator and a second condition we're checking in tandem with making sure there's tags in the first place. Once we verified that there's tags, the next thing to check is to make sure there's an environment tag to begin with. If either of those checks fail, then it will evaluate and say the resource group that you're referencing does not have an environment tag set. So that would stop us with one post condition. The second post condition block does the actual check of what the value is inside of that environment tag and the value that we're setting for all of our resources. So it does a condition of self.tags environment tag equals var.environment tag. If that one fails, now we have an error message that says the resource group does not have the correct environment tag. Okay, so let's see this in action. We'll go to terraform.tfvars. Right now our environment tag is set to production. Let's set it to staging. Let's say we were trying to deploy this stuff to staging. And I'll bring up the terminal once again, and now we'll run a Terraform plan. Don't know why it appeared at the bottom of the screen, but why not? When the Terraform plan runs, once again, it's going to refresh the data source and it's going to run that post condition as soon as that data source is refreshed. So this would actually trigger before it gets to any of the preconditions that are in the virtual network because it has to refresh and do that post condition for the data source before it can do anything with the virtual network resource we're creating. So this might take a moment to refresh all the data sources. I'm going to jump ahead to when it finishes. Okay, if you look at the output here, you can see it went through reading the information for the data sources and running its postcondition check, and it stopped right there. It didn't even get to evaluating the virtual network. And in the failure information, it provides the information about the comparisons we're doing. It lets us know that the environment value for our resource group was production, the environment tag for our input variable was staging, and then it has the error message down at the bottom, letting us know that the resource group SoapBase East does not have the correct environment tag. Now you could build out these error messages however you want. I tried to keep it relatively simple here. So that is how you could use a post condition block within a data source. These are two relatively simple examples of using pre and post conditions, but I hope they help to illustrate how the blocks themselves work and how they can make your Terraform code more reliable and assist with module development. It really does help you enhance or more easily iterate on updates to your modules. Now, I'm curious how folks out in the field are using pre and post condition blocks. Are you using a pre or a post condition block anywhere in your configuration? If so, how? Let me know in the comments below how you're using this new feature. That's going to do it for today. Thank you as always for watching. If you don't mind liking and subscribing, I would very much appreciate it. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. I've seen a few comments asking me about my eye and what's going on. So just for anybody who's curious, I had a blood vessel break in my eye and it is healing, but it takes like 4 months to heal. So it's slowly fading out. So I hope it's not freaking you out too much, but don't worry. My eye's fine. My vision's fine. It's just a weird thing that happens when you get old. Okay, bye.